Today we have a full program for you. As I said, it is known as Imaging Among the Stars. The programming was motivated by the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, the Apollo 11 moon landing, and with us today we have some very special guests for you. But since that historic flight, imaging from space has advanced dramatically, especially given the aspirations for travel within and beyond our solar system. And the restoration and modernization of the films of historic space missions has also progressed to the point where the past missions again elicit the drama and emotions of those who witnessed the events in person. Regenerating the past and bringing today's images back to Earth from the International Space Station, the Moon, Mars, and beyond require a highly complex mix of technology, science, and brilliant people. Today at SMPTE 2019, it is a very special day as we hear from some of those brilliant people. Today we will begin with Been There and Made That. And in just a moment, David Keighly, Chief Quality Guru of IMAX, he said that really is his title, will moderate a conversation with Todd Douglas Miller, Apollo 11 director and producer, and Colonel Terry Virts, astronaut and director of One More Orbit. But first, let's take a look at an IMAX trailer of Apollo 11. Enjoy.
Hand to that trailer. Yay! So this is a fireside chat. That's the end of that. Good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for coming. It's really a great pleasure to be here. How many people here have seen a space-themed movie, an IMAX space-themed movie? Yeah. I think that in some ways, we made 11 actually, and distributed Apollo 11, so that's our 11th. And I think that's one of the reasons IMAX is still here today, our legacy. We started April 12th, 1981. That was the launch of the first space shuttle, STS-1. Hail Columbia, we made that movie, and I was there 38 years ago at Edwards Air Force Base. But I want to bring up two people here now who actually are filmmakers who made this all possible, one of many, or two of many of the people who've done this, these harrowing experiences through the years. So here is Terry Virts and Todd Douglas Miller. Please come up, guys. We've done a lot of things over the years and bringing space to the IMAX screen. And one of the things I love about this medium is it's so immersive. And one of the things we want to talk about, a couple of movies here, Terry's new movie, he's doing One More Orbit, but also Apollo 11, we just saw the trailer. We've done a lot of space launches, Saturn V's with 7 million pounds of thrust. I think the guy who captured that launch better than anybody was Todd in Apollo 11. We hope that movie resonates with everybody. It's up for some awards, we hope. And I think in IMAX we'll probably bring it back before the end of the year or the beginning of the year. So Todd, tell us a little bit about how you came up with the sound design of the launch of the Saturn V.
Well, I think that was, when we first started out, that was going to be, the thing that was going to make or break really the film. Let's get let's get the sound of a Saturn V launch right, and it really just came down to testing it, and getting people in a room that had seen it and witnessed it. There was very few Saturn V launches, so I don't know. Has anybody seen a Saturn V launch in this room? Okay.
Wow, okay,
One.
cool.
So for us, early on, I was working with my sound designer, Eric Milano, who just really had the luxury of time. We did have some reference audio, but a lot of it was, old analog. It wasn't all that great. We knew we were going to be doing 12-channel IMAX, so let's go to an IMAX room. So we're based in New York, so we would do a lot of testing with certain scenes that we wanted to get as accurate as possible down at the Smithsonian Air and Space. So Zarth Barish and his group down there, we'd work in off hours, and once we started working with the astronauts and their families, and in particular Neil Armstrong's sons, Rick and Mark. Rick, the older one, had witnessed a couple of Saturn V. He was there for 11 when he was a kid, and then went to some subsequent ones. There was some people that worked at NASA. Let's get them in a room. And I remember the first screening we had, I was pretty excited. I'm like, yeah, we nailed this. This is going to be great. We play it, and it's just kind of like crickets,
But besides the dynamic, low frequency, you put that heartbeat in there, and that really made it for me. What was the gestation of putting that heartbeat? The boom.
Yeah,
boom,
I think,
boom.
and what David's talking about for people that maybe haven't seen it is there's a buildup, and it's worth noting that Matt Morton, my music composer, and Eric, we've all worked together for a long time, and I consider music an integral part of the sound design. So those two guys work very well together in conjunction with me, because I like to edit my own film, so we just kind of have a shorthand. And we had talked about not doing what other films had done, which was this giant bombastic, build-up. We just wanted to have a little bit of a break. So it was almost like you get this amazing, tension-filled sequence building up to the launch, 10, 9, 8, 7, and then at 8 seconds is, when they actually, the ignition happens and the fuel comes out. And it always just seemed to me, and Matt and I in the sound design had talked about utilizing heartbeats throughout. It's a big theme in the film, and that would be a perfect place where we would go back to that. And if you were actually to put that same heartbeat, which is measured out in 4/4 time, you can put that entire heartbeat through the entire film. So when I edit in 4/4 time. At least this film I do. Sometimes it's 3/4, and I keep that on mute. So if I ever lose my way in the edit, I could go back to it. But
So you're giving away your secret, like Mr. Nolan likes to use that ticking of the clock.
yeah, so
in
he likes a
Dunkirk,
clock.
So there's
kind of like a heartbeat.
sound is so important for that suspension of disbelief. So we talked about the Saturn V. The gentleman next to you, there's nobody here who's ridden a rocket into space, and Terry has. Terry, tell us about riding a 1950 technology Soyuz rocket to the space station. What the hell is that like?
Well, I'll tell you, it was not nearly as scary for me as watching Todd's movie. I mean, sitting there watching that Saturn V launch, my heart was beating much more than it was riding the shuttle or the Soyuz. It was a great scene. The heartbeat was perfect.
Yeah.
The shuttle was like a big muscle car, is the way I describe it. Lots of vibration. It got up to 3G, so lay on your back and have 3 of your best friends lay on top of you is kind of the pressure you feel. But the Soyuz is actually an ICBM. It's an old Soviet nuclear missile, so that thing is more like a Ferrari. It gets up and goes, and it doesn't stick around. And there's no like dramatic, let everybody film it. It just boom, it's gone. So
Right.
they're both great. I enjoyed both.
And and you've spent 213 days in space, 185 hours in EVA, and on STS-130 and the Soyuz TMA-15. So what's the experience? Todd has taken us to the moon by getting all this old footage, which you'll hear about a little bit later with Wilcox and Mattel about how they made that happen. But what's it like to be up there looking at those things and filming? What does it do to your soul, really? Because this is this little marble down there. What does it do to you as a person being up there to film that? And what's in your heart when you do that?
Yeah, for me it was a really profound. I remember the first time I saw the Earth and the sunrise, and I saw this shade of blue that I'd never seen, and I wasn't expecting to see a color I'd never seen before. And it was so hard. I mean, I was a shuttle pilot, so I had things to do. Right. And I just wanted to look at the Earth. It was so magnetic. It just draws your eyes to it. And it was a very emotional thing to be here and your planet is over there. Like, I'm not on my planet anymore. And that was kind of very powerful emotionally. And I really wanted to share the experience with people. I did, Twitter and Instagram, and just to try and share what it's like to be in space. I had the honor of getting to work on an IMAX movie along with a lot of other folks, to one of Tony Meyer's movies. And of all the stuff I did in that 7 months in space, I think the IMAX movie was the most important because it shared the experience with people. The other experiments were great, but they're obscure and no one really heard about most of them, but the IMAX is something that millions of people, and it's really about life on Earth. At the end of the day, space exploration is awesome and I love it, and I'm a space nerd and I got posters on my wall, growing up as a kid. But at the end of the day, it's about life down here on Earth, and exploration can unite us, especially Apollo 11, unlike anything else.
So speaking of taking those images, we've got a little short clip. Who out there saw A Beautiful Planet, one IMAX film? Well, okay, 15 or 20. Let's, we want to get into, because we're all a bit, we're SMPTE nerds here. I want Terry to talk about how we captured this stuff right now. So we're going to play the little piece from A Beautiful Planet of London in the daytime, and it's self-explanatory. I think you're in the track here, I'm not sure. Can we roll that?
We are approaching England and its great capital, London. Across the English Channel to the right is France and the glorious city of Paris. Europe lies beyond.
During the daytime, it's kind of hard to tell that people are on Earth. You don't see that much evidence of humanity.
But at night, the same view tells a different story. It's easy to see how populated our planet really is, and how many of us have gathered in towns and cities.
So obviously your movie, for 50 years, people had hoarded this 65 millimeter negative, and you figured out how to use it. Can you just tell us a little bit about how long it took you to get there? Who were the people that helped you? Because as Terry said, the imagery is stunning. The launch, there's some 8-perf in there. I know Final Frame helped you get that on the screen. Tell us a little bit about, in a minute, how you got that all together.
Yeah, so we'd done a short film about Apollo 17, and that bought us a lot of cachet within the halls of NASA. A lot of people liked it there. So when it came time to do Apollo 11, we were, the idea was to rescan all the available 16 and 35 millimeter. And to our surprise, they had found in this research project a few months into just trying to quantify exactly how much material was in all the various NASA vaults, and also at the National Archives, which is the repository for all NASA footage. They found what they called the Panavision collection, which was the 65 5-perf stuff. So we ended up scanning all of that. Consisted, all told, it was a little over 500 reels. And we'll talk a little bit about it in the next session. But Final Frame, with their prototype film scanner, was able to just scan this in a very revolutionary way.
So Terry, tell us a little bit about how you got those 143 shots. The movie's a combination of 190 shot with a Canon C300, I think, and then a DSLR to get those night shots. Tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So our director of photography, James Nyhouse, I would call him occasionally on the space station as a cell phone, and I'd call him on Sunday morning. Hey James, I'm working on this night lightning shot. What ISO should I use? And that was a pretty fun process. But of all the IMAX movies you guys have seen, or the Apollo 11 movie, it's all on film, which pretty much means daylight ISO. So it's mostly been all daylight stuff. And Beautiful Planet was the first time we ever used digital. And the big advantage, there were two big advantages. One was you could do night, so you could push the Canon 1DC, a still camera that was shot on, to about 10,000 ISO. So that it enabled the first ever night IMAX stuff. And the auroras are beautiful, and the night cities are beautiful. The other thing we could do, we had a GoPro. So it was a little GoPro. It was actually a Russian GoPro. They went to Best Buy and bought one, and they built this white box, you know, with the thermal protection on it, kept it pressurized. And so the first time ever you could take a GoPro outside. You can't take one of these giant 80-pound, you know, 10 frames or 10 feet per second IMAX cameras outside. But you can take a GoPro outside. And Tony put together the most amazing spacewalking montage. When I saw that, I thought, holy crap, what was I thinking, man? That looks scary. She did a really nice job. She did a nice job on the EVA. But so the first time ever inside the Soyuz, spacewalking and night scenes you can see, and that really made Beautiful Planet, I think, really awesome.
And when you were up on, just to segue into the space station, you were there with, you know, an international crew, with the Russians. And how many? Well, you were there. You were in days of 213 days. When you were on this space, were you there for 213 days?
My first flight was 2 weeks. My second flight was 200 days. So in total, it was about that.
So what do you do for 200 days in a little place like that?
You film an IMAX movie.
Okay. All right.
I mean, NASA fills your day, you know, from 7 to 7. You got stuff to do, and unfortunately, you have to repair the equipment and unload the cargo ship and fix the toilet and do spacewalks. But in the evening, they didn't give me any time to film IMAX. They gave me 1 hour of like equipment familiarization. And some of my NASA friends are here, and we love cameras and video and storytelling, but the bosses love work. So
Right.
I had to work during the day, and then in my spare time, I would go shoot this. It wasn't just me. There was several other astronauts that worked on it too.
And of course, one thing, you know, familiar because I've followed spaceflight since a kid, but you know, to get those shots, you know, over London in the daytime, you're orbiting, the Earth is turning under you, so the next 90 minutes you're not maybe in the right
Yeah.
place. You got to figure all that stuff out.
When
right?
I'm like, I'm going to be there for half a year. I got plenty of time, and that's not a very short amount of time. I realized that was not true. So I finally got a picture of the pyramids on day 199. Literally, the last
Right.
day was the first time. Normally you get 1 day pass and 1 night pass per day.
Of a specific
Of whatever point, yeah. But usually it's not there. Usually it's a couple hundred miles off to the side. It's cloudy. You're working that moment. You're coming over, or you're asleep. So to get shots, so Tony had a shot list of 300 places that she wanted, and I just said, Tony, my brain's going to explode. So she would prioritize the top 10. So she would take the time to look ahead. Okay, this week you're going to be flying over, and you should be awake during this time. And she kind of kept on updating me with her top 10 shot list, and that way I could manage it, because 300 was too many. She did give me good advice, though. I think she trained 150 astronauts over the 30-year career, and I think she told us all the same thing. If you see an alien, shoot it. Just because it's not on the shot list doesn't mean you shouldn't shoot it. So that was her advice.
And shooting, there's the thing called the cupola, which is that windowed thing onto
Yes.
the world. That's where you're shooting out of mostly?
Yes, I actually got to install that. On my shuttle flight, I installed it, and then a couple years later, I went back, and a lot of Beautiful Planet was shot from the cupola.
And I remember Tony telling us, this probably maybe not for public consumption, but doesn't really matter, about they didn't want to scratch it, so
Oh
they
my
had,
God.
tell us about the
Yeah.
scratch, and we need it clear so we can get good pictures. Tell us about
So
that.
the windows are really pristine, and NASA got some like 50-cent plastic to cover them to protect it. And I installed it. It looked great. I went back a couple years later. It looked like somebody had a food fight in there. I mean, it was like completely destroyed. What the heck were you guys doing? So IMAX invented this thing where we took the cover off, and it was like a plastic shield. You open it up, stuck the camera, took the picture, and then slid the plastic back. So it was a great way to make the cupola usable, because otherwise it's like Christopher Nolan flare times 1,000. It's nothing but, you know, smudgy flares and stuff.
Okay, cool. Going back to Apollo 11, one of the most dramatic, besides the launch, one of the amazing things in the movie to me is how, Todd, you develop the emotion when you're landing, because if you know the movie like I do, and if you've been a space nerd like a lot of us, the alarm that went off, it was a 12:01 and 12:02 alarm, and you so well portrayed that with the fuel gauge going down and the blinking light. And I mean, I was on the edge of my seat, and I've seen it 100 times. It still gets me. Tell us a little bit how that got evolved.
Well, it really started with our archive producer, Stephen Slater, who's based in the UK, and he had been doing, he'd been syncing up a lot of MOS shots from Mission Control with all the publicly available audio. And right around the time that we had the, excuse me, the footage, we also, NASA gave us 18,000 hours of audio, Mission Control audio. 11,000 hours of that was Apollo 11. So
With no sync.
with no sync, it was on just, you know, a hard drive, and it had a lot of, this was all 1-inch analog, so it had all this inherent audio drift. They had introduced a hum and some other technical, you know, imperfections during the digitization of it. So it took a long time. My colleague Ben up in Feist up in Toronto was able to work with a grad student out in Germany that developed some code and software to be able to sync all of that stuff up. So when we got it, it was all lined up in a 9-day sequence. And that's kind of where the landing sequence came from, was exactly, we knew from the transcripts and talking with mission control specialists, the ones that are still around today, kind of what the feeling was in the room, and we wanted to recreate that through the audio. But I always wanted to stay on the shot of the actual landing. A lot of times in fiction and nonfiction, they cut away and it becomes this chaotic thing. But to my mind, Buzz Aldrin shot one of the most iconic pieces of cinema ever, which was landing on another world for the first time. Why in the hell would you ever cut away from that? So we show it in, you know, real time as it happens. We sped it up, you know, a little bit just for you know, time, because it's an 11-minute sequence and we do it in 4. But there was the 12:02 alarm starts going off, which in the 12:01 alarms were going off, and in kind of Apollo 11 lore, everybody knew that there was the abort or no abort came down to a 24-year-old engineer sitting in the back room named Jack Garman. And when we had that 11,000 hours, we had for the first time his actual audio. So we incorporated that in, and then I just got the idea. I said, you know, it'd be weird if the alarms were going off inside the cabin, and I knew they had the Snoopy, you know, helmets or headsets on. So maybe they had a headset. So we asked, you know, Buzz Aldrin, you know, did it go through your headset, and what did the tone sound like? And he's like, yeah, we had it on, you know, we heard it through, you know, a headset. And then we went through NASA's chief historian, Bill Barry. He found out through the MIT Flight Dynamics group that there was actually a kilohertz tone on and off. It was documented. We gave it to our sound designer, Eric. He put it in the scene. Again, we went and tested that, showed it to Buzz. Did we get it right? You know, 4 or 5, you know, here and slip it there. Until we got it like as accurate as what we could. And then we just tried to treat that entire sequence with kid gloves. So you're only getting the information that you would need, I guess. And same thing with the music. Instead of doing a big bombastic score, just kind of integrate it in with everything else and just muxed it all together. And then by the time you're 10 seconds away and the fuel's running low, you just take it all, you strip it all away, and you just...
And it was, I think, as I remember, there was 16 seconds of fuel left when they landed, correct?
Yeah, which Neil Armstrong has said, and we spent a long time researching the time, just getting the time right. A lot of our work with the project, which I'm really proud to say has influenced the historical record, and working with NASA's historian, but Neil Armstrong famously said, you know, 16 seconds is a lifetime to a naval aviator.
They had nerves of steel.
Is that true? To a naval aviator.
16 seconds.
16 seconds of fuel.
Well, how accurate are those gauges? I mean, he might have had 1 second.
Right.
The 1969 gauge technology was
Yeah.
probably not 100% accurate.
But you captured the emotion very, very well. So, Terry, you're just finished a new movie, and so you learned, I guess, making the space movies. You're an astronaut. Some people became astronauts because of IMAX movies, but now you've gone on. Yep, there you go. There's another one.
Yep.
One more orbit. You took a Gulf Stream over the poles around the Earth a couple of months ago, and you're making a film about it. Tell us a little bit about that.
So a friend of mine has wanted to do this for a couple of years in honor of Apollo 11. It was the 50th anniversary, to set a world record. And in May, before, a couple months before July, he said, well, Terry, why don't you make a movie about it? And my head kind of exploded because we had weeks, not years or months to put this together. And my first thought was, well, how am I going to make a movie? I mean, the world, flying, you can make a short about it, but how do you do a movie about it? And I was really concerned about that. And at the end of the day, I put together a great team. I used the same DP, James Nyhouse from IMAX. We had teams in 5 places around the world because we had to stop for refueling. And we got the airplane from Qatar executives, so we had like a mission control in Qatar. And after a few months of thinking, we'd written out a script, what we were going to do, and it hit me that I think like a lot of good science fiction, there's aliens and lasers and spaceships and that kind of thing, but that's not what the movie's about. Like, there's deeper things that the movie's about. So the world record was kind of the excuse for the movie that we did, but at the end of the day, there's an environmental component about it, flying over the North Pole, and it's cracked ice and water down there, and there's a big human component. I got my Russian cosmonaut friend, Gennady Padalkov, flew with us, and he's really funny, and that's a big part of the movie. Of the 10 people on the airplane, we were from 10 different places. So in a world that seems to be going crazy now, I really wanted to show cooperation and how exploration can bring us together. We found the lady in Mauritius. We had to stop there for gas. And the team that went there, the guy went in the control tower and just yelled to everybody, does anybody know, Mita Bilal? And they met, she was like the Walter Cronkite of Mauritius. And so they didn't have a link, so NASA sent them these training videos of cheesy Saturn V models. So in Mauritius, that was what she showed real time to make it look like the moon landing. So anyway, so we got that story. So there's all these interesting side stories around the framework of setting the world record.
And so you did, in the world record was 33, you took you 33 hours?
46.
Okay.
And yeah, so a little bit less than 2 days.
Right, and tell us a little, I read a little bit, because I follow your tweets and stuff. When you're over the Antarctic, you didn't have to worry about any air traffic control because there's nobody there.
We were the air traffic over Antarctica. It was a winter time. In the North Pole, Europe to the Middle East to LA, people fly near the North Pole, but no one flies over the South Pole, not in the wintertime. We had 20 hours of darkness on the bottom half. Right. It was interesting to compare orbiting the Earth from an airplane to orbiting in the space.
Just going back to your times on the space station, you were there with an international crew. Mm-hmm. What's you probably had Russians there. I know the Italian lady. So tell us a little bit about the dynamics of the different nationalities out there.
That was my favorite part, was flying with an international crew. I tried to have dinner with the Russians every night. I'd put my dinner in a Ziploc and float down to their segment. We got to be great friends. We still, stay in touch, and he flew with me on the mission. Samantha, of course, is Italian, I flew with. So again, we were flying during Crimea and Ukraine and sanctions, and if you check Twitter recently, it hasn't been great between the US and Russia, and yet there we were in space.
And they are today, still, right? There's Russians there today.
That's how we get to the space station.
And that's the only way you can do it,
ever
right?
since 2011, yeah.
Yes.
So that was a great part, and during all this turbulence on the ground, a whole chapter in my book, View from Above, is about this emergency we had where the Russian deputy prime minister was in this big battle with the US, but when we had the emergency, he called us on the radio and said, hey, you guys can stay as long as you want, you can work together. It was a great example of cooperation, I think, how things can and should happen. And space really brings that out. Everything else seems to not bring that out, make it worse, but exploration in space is one uniting force. Even Apollo 11, that was really bad, the Cold War, and yet everybody around the world, that was a big reason and part of the movie I made.
So we're going to take some questions, but IMAX, as I said, we've done a lot of space movies, 11 of them, and this is an oral history by Neil Armstrong taken at Johnson Space Center, September 19, 2001. I just want to read you a little bit of this. I'm a bad reader, so bear with me. The final descent to landing. That was far and away the most complex part of the flight. The systems were very heavily loaded at the time. The unknowns were rampant. The systems in this mode had only been tested on Earth and never in a real environment. There was just 1,000 things to worry about in the final descent. It was the hardest for the system, and it was the hardest for the crews to complete that part of the flight successfully. But having said that, it wasn't too hard because 6 crews were successfully able to do that. So perhaps my concern at that point was more than it should have been. But it was the thing that I worried about the most, just because it was so difficult. Walking around on the surface on a scale of 1 to 10 was a 1. And I thought the lunar descent on a scale of 1 to 10 was a 13. So guys, what was the hardest thing you had to accomplish on Apollo 11 and one more orbit? First to you, Terry.
For me?
Yeah.
The time compression was pretty severe, but I think coming up with a story, you know, the visuals were great. You can get really cool pictures of airplanes flying and out the window, but I think any movie needs character and story, so trying to figure out how to make the story, you know, just watching people sit in an airplane for 48 hours is not going to be that exciting. So that, for me, that was the biggest challenge.
And what about on your space flight? You know, the Soyuz launch, and so you launched on Soyuz and you came back on the Soyuz too?
The second time, yeah.
Okay, so what was the hardest part about that stuff?
Launching on a Soyuz or landing in a Soyuz?
Whatever.
It's not a space shuttle. The space shuttle is this big, you know, airliner, and the Soyuz is like a little bowling ball. And when the chutes come out, it starts tumbling. It was a pretty awesome ride home. We were yelling and hooting and hollering.
And the landing, I mean, there's little retro rockets that poof out at the end, right? But
they call them the soft landing rockets. My recommendation was the less of a crash landing rockets. It's like, imagine driving through your neighborhood and then just drifting over and running into a telephone pole. That's kind of what it felt like.
And then they had it.
But it works. Just a second, it works.
Yes, every time.
The Soyuz came back backwards one time, like with the heat shield behind it, and it worked. So that's, you know, and the shuttle crashed twice, and the Soyuz actually crashed twice in the very beginning for other reasons, but the Russian stuff is not as complicated or advanced as our stuff, but it works. And
that Soyuz rocket, and when I look at the Soyuz rocket today, it looks very similar to the rocket that Gagarin went up in.
It's because it is.
It is.
it's very similar.
That's right. It is.
Yeah.
Awesome stories. So, buddy, what do you think? What was the toughest part?
I mean, outside of all the technical hurdles, and you know, you'll hear from Will. We could talk an hour, you know, in the next session about all that. I think it was just sticking to our guns creatively, what we wanted to do. I mean, even before we had the large format and all the wealth of material to tell the story, working with the astronauts and their families, they started turning over material. So it was very difficult to say to Michael Collins or, you know, Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong's sons, you know, we don't want to use it. This isn't the right, you know, documentary for that. We just kind of want to stick with the mission. And for those of you who've seen the film early on, we do have flashback sequences for each astronaut, just get you just a taste up in what their life was like until they, you know, stepped, you know, out of, or went into the rocket. So that was pretty difficult because I didn't know how they were gonna take that, and I didn't want, you know, when we were making, it was a fan film. We were making it, you know, for them just as much as all of us that were creating it.
Well, it's a great film, and you know, I know that I worked on a very early film where we actually used a Saturn IIB, I think it was the Skylab launch, in To Fly, which still plays at the Air and Space Museum, started in '76 or whatever that is, almost 50 years. And I think your movie, great documentation, will play the next 50 years at the Johnson Space Center. We just put a projector in there. So it's really great for kids, and you know, I've got 2 little grandsons who saw it, and he remembered his first movie. He remembered everything about that. He even remembered Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin's name, and he's 3 years old. So
well,
it's got a lot of power.
Because you're here, we should talk about your contribution to space as well. How many IMAX films you've done, and David Keighly is the space guy outside of just being the guru over there. So thanks to you and your wife Patricia, you guys have done amazing work throughout the decades to bring all these incredible images that we have, and I think, you know, we're all part of it.
Right.
You know, what Terry's doing recently. If people
Part of a
haven't
team.
seen. Yeah, and to tell this great, you know, canon of space
But
stories.
To Fly, so you worked on To Fly.
Yeah, I To Fly, I didn't actually make it, but it was the first stoop negative ever made in IMAX history. Made it in '69 because the negative was falling apart, and we made hundreds of prints on it. And you know, The Dream is Alive. There's always a little bit of a friendly rivalry between McGilvery-Freeman and IMAX of what's the most successful movie: The Dream is Alive with Walter Cronkite, or To Fly.
To Fly was produced by Francis Thompson.
Francis Thompson, yeah, we worked with him many years ago. So we got 5 minutes here. You got anybody at the mic and like to do some questions? I see a couple guys going there.
Years ago, the name is Rod Evenson. Years ago, I took a film studies course from a gentleman named Andreas Dynam, who had been an assistant director to Fritz Lang. Wow. And he tells about when Fritz Lang discovered that his movie, Frau und Mond, otherwise known as Rocket to the Moon, was the inspiration to Wernher von Braun for the V2. He says the reaction was he went ballistic.
I'll say a quick thing. Every space mission gets a poster. Sometimes they're funny, cheesy. There's Star Wars and Star Trek posters. Ours was Metropolis, which was the first science fiction movie by Fritz Lang. Yeah.
And of course, Wernher von Braun, when I saw the original cut, because there's two versions of the Neon distributed, and there's a 90-minute and there's a 42-minute, and I said, you got to make sure that Wernher von Braun is in both.
That's right. That came from you, and I put 2 shots of him in
Yeah,
there just for you.
exactly, because he's the guy. I mean, that rocket, I still think today, they're using that rocket, those engines, to kind of figure out how to do the next generation of thrust. Yeah. You have to talk to Elon Musk about that, I guess. Yes, sir, go.
Thank you very much. So for me, I remember Apollo 11 greatly because we went out and bought our first color TV to watch the landing on the moon in black and white. And you know, the irony of that never ceases to amaze me. But, you know, it was just amazing watching what we were doing as humans at that time, and even early in the space shuttle missions. And then the space shuttle sort of become known as the space truck, and people stopped watching. And by the time the Challenger had crashed, there was only one radio network even bothering to cover it live by that time. And so the interest sort of waned as it became almost humdrum, unfortunately. And now I see this in your movie, and it's fantastic, and it just rekindles all of that spirit and imagination. As we are now going to the moon again, how do we make sure to keep that spirit alive? How do we as filmmakers and technologists make sure that the public is fully engaged and really is as excited as they were back in the days of Apollo 11?
What's your next project? It's going to be another moon project, or maybe a Mars project?
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I had the pleasure of becoming friends with Al Reiner, who made For All Mankind, if people know that, and he was a screenwriter on Apollo 13. Fortunately, he passed away while we were making our film. But Al and I used to talk all the time about, you know, he would crack me up because he would just giggle like a 10-year-old little boy when he saw people walking on the moon, astronauts from all the Apollo missions. And he'd seen it a million times, you know, over the decades. And I had contacted him pretty early on just to say, look, there's a couple things I need to steal from you, and I want your permission to make a homage in the short film we were doing for 17. And he said, steal away. He gave me a great quote. He said, you know, we're all just links in this chain to tell this wonderful canon of the history of space, and also to preserve all of this material for future filmmakers to continue to tell these stories. And I think when we were making at least Apollo 11, and that work still continues, we're still engaged with the National Archives, we're still engaged with NASA.
There's a lot of footage you even haven't looked at.
Yeah, right? that still needs to be scanned, and that to put it back in the public domain so future filmmakers have access to it and can tell, you know, as hopefully compelling stories.
Terry?
I think one of the advantages today, you can say, yeah, people aren't as interested, but there's so much, if you're interested in space, there's so much content you have. I mean, there's Twitter and the internet. When I was a kid, I was interested in it, but I could never see anything. I'd have to go buy a book, you know, about history. But there's a lot of content today that is out there for people who are interested in space. So I think in some ways, the whole public in general probably doesn't know what's happening in space exploration, but for those who are interested in it, they know way more than we ever have known before. But I think the key is just to tell good stories. It's about character and story at the end of the day. The technical stuff is interesting, but if you can come up with a Luke Skywalker and Chewbacca set of characters, that's the key, is to think creatively and come up with a story.
Well, yeah, obviously this is SMPTE, and let's remember those words and let's keep going to the movies. Star Wars is coming up. Good luck with one more orbit, and good luck with your next film. And Elon, Tesla went up $45 last night in after-hours trading, so maybe Elon's got a little more money to go to the moon or Mars a little faster. That's it. 8765432.